Welcome back to Leaders, a podcast dedicated to exploring the best leaders this world has ever seen. Thanks for making it back to episode 2. In episode 1, we covered Jim Senegal, the founder and CEO of Costco. In today's episode, we'll cover someone who's widely known in the leadership world, and that is Steve Jobs of Apple fame. I'll try to keep this podcast to a weekly or bi-weekly cadence, hopefully filling in research, and I have a good, queue of leaders teed up for future episodes. And so Steve, as I mentioned, is studied far and wide. It's well known that he was a tremendous leader through his years at Apple and other companies that I will cover. And arguably, he's the greatest executive of our era in terms of what he created at Apple. His different stints in different companies in between his time at Apple when he was kind of forced out and then came back in his second stint at Apple, which, found great success. And really, there's a lot of great books out there, lots of great content. You can find countless YouTube videos of him talking about marketing, him getting interviewed about various topics. Really, a lot of the source of my research that I found really useful is another podcast that I follow really closely, and that is Founders Podcast. So host David Senra has read over 300 biographies, of which he's read, I think, 7 or 8 at this point, biographies or books on Steve Jobs specifically, or people that have worked closely with Steve Jobs. And so he has a tremendous wealth of content and knowledge in terms of studying Steve extensively. So I leaned heavily a lot on those podcasts as inspiration for this podcast, obviously with our emphasis here on Steve the leader. So we will walk through our main sections here of his rise to the CEO path, which, as we just compare last episode of Jim, he was a very authentic leader. He grew up in retail, lived through his values, all of that. What we will find with Steve here is that, he was all over the board in terms of who you talk to and at one point in career you talk to them at. So he has very different time frames and ups and downs in his career that we will highlight, and I think that make him just a very interesting person to study, because honestly I think he is like no other and very unique, and really a lot of what shows through in his personality and leadership style really yielded tremendous results, and results of which I think a good leader can have consistent general results, but a great leader like Steve can really outperform and really transcend the industry and make, he first and foremost, he's a product person, and he created a lot of the products and vision for them that we continue to use to this day. So we'll talk a little bit about going into now his defining career moments in business success. So diving in here into Steve Jobs and in episode 2, the best power that he had, I think, was deciding what product Apple should make next. And a lot of what he focused on with that was not necessarily consumer research or polling people, understanding industry-wide what was going on. He was really having a lot of that inspiration and thought process outside of that. It was a lot on his instincts. And so he's always kind of quoted as saying, he's creating products before people realize that they need them. And so that is definitely a kind of hallmark trait, I would say, of his career. And one in which, a lot of people know him from the Apple fame, but he had a fundamental role within taking Pixar public. And so he decided actually to do that. And he was involved in the first kind of animation film that they went after, which was actually Toy Story. And so they decided to take Pixar public right after the Toy Story release, which at this point, being a first animated film, ultimately it could have flopped. So this could have went really poorly to decide to go IPO and go public right after the release of a film of that stature. But ultimately what that led to is 30 million, and then to take that to 362 million right after that. I think in terms of his influence with Pixar and his creative juices within the animation world and the ability to see all of that is a parallel to how George Lucas kind of negotiated Star Wars, which is an interesting tidbit there, in that George Lucas, Lucasfilms, and Star Wars, he was able to negotiate, a small percentage of merchandise and retail indefinitely, which led to a whole lot of success, as we know, with the Star Wars franchise. And Steve, within his Pixar realm, saw great success with this Toy Story release. So I think that was kind of a key moment, I would say, in his career that we can highlight here. And there's just another quote here as well that I think encapsulates a lot of what his vision for Apple kind of was. So he says, hardware, software, developer relations, marketing. It turns out that, in my opinion, that is Apple's greatest strategic advantage. It is Apple's core strategic advantage. If you believe that there's still room for innovation in this industry, which I do, because Apple can then innovate faster than anyone else. The great thing is that Apple's DNA hasn't changed. The place where Apple has been standing for the last 2 decades is exactly where computer technology and the consumer electronics markets are converging. So it's not like we're having to cross the river to go somewhere else. The other side of the river is coming to us. So I think that quote encapsulates, what was Apple's, key sustainable advantage that they had over competitors, and it was the ability to innovate. It was the ability to really try to converge the ever emerging and evolving technologies with a core product within the consumer electronics market that they continue to diversify over time, whether that be the iPod, a lot of their computers and PCs and AirPods, those sort of things, were very transcending. So just a few key little points to start the conversation there in terms of some of his career moments and business success that I wanted to highlight there first and foremost. That's not to say that, Steve started Apple obviously with Steve Wozniak, was there for a handful of years, and then was more or less forcefully thrown out of the company, frankly. And then that kind of forced him to reset and then actually start his own venture, which ended up being Next Computer, which actually leads me into, I think, one of the bigger failures that that company that he ended up starting really was in terms of its product. And I think it was a key time because Steve really struggled, I think, in terms of a series of a lack of good business decisions when it came to starting and trying to scale Next Computer. And, one of these decisions was what market do we go into with the Next Computers? And he decided to try and target universities with this product, which ended up being the wrong kind of market to target, just really hard to break into. A lot of universities really weren't at a position and timing wise for when he kind of tried to launch this. He ended up burning about $250 million of capital in 2 to 3 years. But I think even the miracle in terms of this smaller failure within his career is that he somehow gets the Apple CEO at the time, Joe Amelio, to buy Next Computer for $450 million. And so that kind of forays us into his re-entrance into Apple. and his entrance into a CEO position, which leads us into, I think, the main section that I really want to cover off on here is to dive in as Steve as the person and Steve as the leader. So these are kind of just going to be broken out into smaller sections here, kind of as a title, and then maybe a few quotes and descriptions as to what really entailed that. So we're just going to start here with Steve ultimately was a products first person. So he focused on what he was best at, which really was creating products, recruiting, marketing, and of course being the public face of the company. So, he starts all the Apple Talks, the Apple launches are infamous in terms of how he launched the iPod and other products that he interviewed, but he described it in a 2004 interview to say, "I get to spend my time on the forward-looking stuff. My top executives take half the other work off my plate. They love it, and I love it." So he was, Steve was a visionary in terms of looking forward and having a really long view on where this market was going and how Apple could be positioned to really capitalize on that. And then, a great quote that is also from Steve is that he says, "My passion has been to build an enduring company where people were motivated to make great products. Everything else was secondary. Sure, it was great to make a profit because that's what allowed you to make great products, but the products, not the profits, were the motivation." So I alluded to this before, but he's figuring out what the customer wants before they even do themselves. So really being product driven and simplifying the design process and really being involved in the nuts and bolts and process of the engineers, the design, always being very meticulous around product feedback and getting things really right on that end, really has them being product driven. And once you perfect the product, the profits will follow because people will want the product. And he was building innovative products and that lasting company, which was a lot of reinventing Apple as to the company itself and what products it carried over time. And another thing I think he did have was a bias towards action. And I call this kind of action and instinct. So he had a religious faith in the strength of his instincts. And he even says, "You've got to act and you've got to be willing to fail. You've got to be ready to crash and burn with people on the phone, with starting a company, with whatever. If you're afraid of failing, you won't get very far." So, oftentimes Steve, if he had an idea and everything, let's try it, let's test it, let's act on this, and let's live and learn, and let's move on and see, does this product make sense? If it doesn't, let's scrap it. If it does, let's move forward, let's push forward. And that'll be another kind of common theme here as to, not only is it acting on it and doing that, but also at the speed and focus that he did that at as well. And so in some cases, he's a product first person. He starts Apple in his early 20s, and that's his main focus. And as he scales this and he scales Apple, they're having to add employees, and ultimately he's going to have to be thrown into a position where he's in a management and leadership position, of which, in describing some of the early days and the employees that are there, early on, he wasn't frankly a great manager. He was a product person first and a manager, or trying to be a manager, second. And so there's an employee that was kind of quoted to say, while Mr. Jobs' stated positions on management techniques are all quite noble and worthy in practice, he is a dreadful manager. He is an unfortunate case of mouthing the right ideas, but not believing in or executing them when it comes time to do something. And then it continues, Jobs regularly misses appointments. He does not give credit where due. He plays favorites. He has favorites who can do no wrong, and others who could do no right. He interrupts and doesn't listen. He doesn't keep promises. He is a prime example of a manager who takes the credit for his optimistic schedules and then blames the worker when the deadlines are not met. And then finally here, he was not a model boss or human being tightly packaged for emulation. Driven by demons, he would drive those around him to fury and despair. But his personality and passions and products were all interrelated. His tale is thus both instructive and cautionary, filled with lessons about innovation, character, leadership, and values. So, earlier on in the Apple days, obviously he's trying to really push the envelope here and really trying to, some employees are not going to respond well to his management style and techniques. And I think it's going to take some time for him to really hone his craft on the leadership and management aspects of becoming a CEO, of becoming managing people and directing them into your united vision for that. So again, this was kind of just early days, kind of one employee manager describing his interactions with Steve earlier on. But on the same end, though, I think once he gets to the positive people side, and really the people and employees, and many of them were, really resonated with Steve and his job and his quality of his vision and management style that really people grew and got the most out of. So ultimately, Steve was really focused on constructing a team of very high talent. And so, again, going back to that last quote, it's kind of a contrasting style of traits that he combines. So he's, on one end, charismatic and mesmerizing, but also cold and brutal on the other end too. So, he can have the vision, he can really sell something and display that through product launches and so on and so forth. He's also going to tell you straight up if a product sucks, or if the work that you're doing is not up to his quality. So it can be taken of two ways, but that was really embodying his working style. And there were some upsides to Jobs' demanding and wanting behavior. People who were not crushed end up being stronger. They did better work out of both fear and an eagerness to please. And this is Jobs, just talking more on the people side again, but just a good quote of how he viewed the people that he wanted to be surrounded with. So I've learned over the years that when you have really good people, you don't have to baby them. By expecting them to do great things, you get them to do great things. The original Mac team taught me that A-plus players like to work together, and they don't like if you tolerate B work. Ask any member of the Mac team. They will tell you that it was worth the pain. And there's some things that he does on the Mac team that shows that he really does understand human nature. There is some element of almost like his influence of being a cult leader. His understanding that humans are deeply, deeply tribalistic. And then I think Steve also has a great quote and kind of framework actually for a two-step framework for what to work on. So, in a business setting, as well as any sort of startup setting or even larger company setting, frankly, is always the fundamental question of what to work on. How do I prioritize? And his two-step framework for deciding what to work on is, 1, do you give a shit about it? And then 2, is it a good thing to have in the world? So he has that kind of two-step framework for how he decided what he worked on, and then how he informed his employees as well. And he pushed innovation by not only applying this framework, but also being good at the big picture, and does so by mastering the details. So that's found in how you do one thing is how you do all things. And he really had an ability to learn from each of his experiences. So I go back to some of the failures with Next Computer. I go into his earlier days of building the early kind of Apple I, Apple II, and then later in his career, how he's adjusting to the evolving tech landscape and everything. He's really building on a lot of those experiences and refusing to accept kind of automatically received truths and really trying to question and push the envelope on a lot of those. And so one other big piece I think that Steve shares with a lot of great leaders is his emphasis on focus. So Nolan Bushnell, he was the founder of Atari as well as Chuck E. Cheese, oddly. But he was a early hirer of Steve actually at Atari. So Steve goes to work for Nolan at Atari at age 19, and he's described Steve as having one speed, and that is go. And I think one thing to describe Steve, again, back to his product first, which, at the time he was 21, shortly after his stint at Atari, he's coming up, with the idea of Apple, and that's where he's showing his ability to build a great product. It really wasn't until he was 42 when he really was coming into the CEO role for Apple after he left, where he demonstrates the ability to build and run a great organization. And so it says, at this point in his career, he became a manager. His management mantra was focus. He eliminated excess product lines and cut extraneous features in the new operating system software. He also let go of his control freak desire to manufacture products in his own factories. So it's this magical kind of power of focus when he's coming into the CEO role of Apple that really allows him to be maniacal, frankly, about it. And the focus and simplicity that he also instills in terms of his organizational structure. So he really ultimately would want to make a few great products with A people, not those B's and C's, and not have a very, complex organizational or hierarchy structure in place within Apple. And sometimes, in terms of developing a vision where you're only making a few great products and you're only making them with a handful of really highly talented people, focus often means that you're saying no to things. You're saying no to, I think a lot of times what companies that are succeeding a lot, they may hire a lot. They may go into other product lines to try to see growth levers and build that way. But Steve was really focused on, let's get these few things right and let's hire the highest quality of people to get that done. And he says, I don't focus too much on being pragmatic. Logical thinking has its place, but really go on intuition and emotion. I begin to realize that an intuitive understanding and consciousness was far more significant than abstract thinking and intellectual logical analysis. So again, it goes back to, he's not going out there with the research and analytical and kind of that process. He's really going on intuition. He's going on emotion. He's going on those instincts that he has, that he's built over time in terms of a lot of these products and companies that he's been in. And so he's embracing that grind. He has an intensity to carry things out to an irrational extreme. So he will go where no one else will go in terms of speed of execution or really perfecting a design of a product. And I think the ability to do that yielded the results that it had. And really, Steve, the marketer and the storyteller, I think is another key component of his leadership style. So he says the most powerful person in the world is a great storyteller. And, I think the best example of being a master storyteller are these product demonstrations and the clear use of words that he's using within the marketing of Apple over time. It's very crystal clear as to who they are as a company, what this product does, and how you need to have this product in your life. So Steve the storyteller was really, I think, instrumental. And I think a lot of what influenced the storytelling components of his Apple marketing in the CEO spot when he returned was really his time spent at Pixar. And so I want to take a little bit of time in terms of this final point within this leadership style section and a lot of these quotes that we're generating here to focus on Pixar. And at Pixar, he would lay the foundation of two of his greatest strengths: his ability to fight back in times of distress, and his ability to make the most of an innovation that put him ahead of anyone else in that field. So he began to go against his natural instincts that sometimes the best management technique is to forego micromanagement and give good, talented people the room they need to succeed. And so the co-founder of Pixar and the guy that wrote a great book for managing creatives and his time at Pixar was Ed Catmull. And Ed taught Steve Jobs more about management than anyone else in his career, that he says. And although it would take almost a decade, Steve's Pixar adventure would help him rediscover his self-respect, make a billionaire, and align him with people who would teach him more about the management than anyone he'd ever work with. Without the lessons he learned at Pixar, there would be no great second act at Apple. And Ed Catmull, they're going to make the case that, considering what Pixar was able to create and grow, that he may have been one of the better managers of creative people ever. So this is a great, stint where Steve can learn from him. And it's the fact that every single experience a customer has with your company will either add or subtract from that customer's impression of your company. So that's why Steve obsessed about every single interaction point, not only with the customer and the screen and the device, but also as simple as uploading a credit card or paying for something. Literally every single time the customer interacts with their company, look at that point and eliminate any points of friction or unhappiness that could cause or withdraw from your company's reputation with that customer. So this is one of Steve's many great talents, and I think it's the ability to synthesize separate developments and technologies into something previously unimaginable. So Steve is sometimes kind of referred to as Steve the synthesizer. He's combining and getting a lot of inspiration, not only from the creative arts and sciences pieces, of which some of his kind of college background gets into a little bit, but then also combining that with the technologies and information that he's getting through a lot of what he's studying at Apple. And so the last point here is he's a logical flaw detector. His uncanny ability to see through any BS and to instantly zero in on the weak points of any argument. He grasps the salient points of any situation faster than anyone I've met. And if you can't keep up, that's not his problem. So he kind of cut through everything and just get to the point, or could sense no, this isn't, something that has legs. So again, he's got a lot of different key qualities here. I think that, in summary, make him a very uniquely talented leader, that he's able to do things from the people side of things, which is a little bit unconventional in terms of his leadership and I guess management tactics. With, he has a maniacal focus on the product. He wants to surround himself with people that align with that. He's going to push to get to that final outcome that is going to yield something probably in excess of where a lot of other leaders and managers may go in terms of going the extra mile. So I think a lot of the quotes and people that he's worked with really manifest that through it. And that leads us also into, I think there's a lot of key people that he had interacted with over time, whether working with them directly or not, that he drew inspiration from, that I think is the next place to go here. So within the mentors and heroes that Steve had, he had several key figures that I wanted to point out here. So the first person would be of HP fame. So he, at the age of 12, and this is something Steve always had, which is the ability to just ask for help and unwittingly doing it, no matter who it is and no matter what it was. He was always willing to ask the question or kind of go the extra mile to understand things or get to the right answer to get him to another better vision. And so at the age of 12, Bill Hewlett, one of the founders of HP, Steve simply called Bill, and he was actually trying to build, I think maybe a computer or a component of it, and he called Bill at Intel asking him for a part, and that led to further conversation and questions. So his ability to just pick up the phone and then call the founder of Intel again speaks to Steve's willingness to gather information, frankly. And earlier on as well, he's starting Apple around 2021. He then meets famed Intel CEO Andy Grove at the age of 21, and he'll interact with Andy and respect really a lot of his strength, and Steve will call his friend and confidant, and there is one story that he told Grove that he was torn about whether or not to return as Apple CEO when he was debating this, time that he was going to return for his second stint at Apple. And he wound his way through this kind of tortured deliberation, should I do it, should I not? And Andy Grove kind of responded to him and growled and said, "Steve, I don't give a shit about Apple. Just make up your mind." And then Steve hung up the phone, and that actually helped Steve make the decision because he's like, "Oh, I do give a shit about Apple. I need to go back there." So Andy, like Steve, was really frank and to the point, and really guided him into making that key decision that obviously shaped Steve's career there as well. And one other person that was instrumental in Steve's development and one of his bigger heroes that I had honestly never known or heard of before coming across the Founders Podcast and studying Steve and his influences was Edwin Land of Polaroid. And so Edwin had a ton of different inventions, patents, really successful in terms of building out Polaroid. And he kind of combined the intersection of humanities and science, and also this idea of combining the liberal arts with technology. And so a lot of that was the influence for Pixar. And Steve really looked at Edwin Land as being one of the best inventors out there. And he looked at a lot of that as a way of discovering products. And so Steve is quoted as saying specifically about Edwin that his obsessive commitment to creating products of style, practicality, and great consumer appeal, and his reliance on gut instinct rather than consumer research and the restless obsession and invention he brought to the company he founded. So, that description you can insert for both Edwin Land as well as Steve Jobs. So he, heavily relied upon and studied Edwin in his career as well. Another big piece that fits into the Pixar mold here is also Walt Disney. So he was very Walt Disney inspired as well, and he admired that Walt had fun doing the impossible, so he looked after that, and he also admired Walt's obsession with detail and design. Another person that Steve really admired too, and he got to know in his earlier days at Apple, was Bill Gates, and he really admired Bill earlier on as Bill the business person and his persistence. So in reading more and more on Bill Gates and who he was when he started Microsoft and the type of personality and style he had is, I think, tremendously different than how he may be viewed today. And so when Steve came back to Apple, the first call that he made was actually to Bill Gates to figure out the Apple and Microsoft kind of relationship and work through some patents. And to Steve's credit and to Steve's kind of really emphasis on simplifying things, he got the negotiation to be very simple and really move forward with the Apple-Microsoft relationship that propelled Apple forward with that. So Steve, again, admires Bill Gates and drew a lot from him. Another person was also Nolan Bushnell that I mentioned before at Atari. So this is Steve's boss when he's at Atari at 19, and he drew a lot of great inspiration, and just seeing Nolan in execution at Atari was a great influence of him as well. Another person here is Bob Noyce. So when Steve got back to Apple, that's what I decided to try and do. You need to have a collaborative hiring process. When we hire somebody, even if they're going to be in marketing, I'll have to tell them talk to the design folks and the engineers. And he will mention another role model of his was actually J. Robert Oppenheimer. And I read about the type of people he sought for the atom bomb project. I wasn't nearly as good as he was, but that's what I aspire to do. So in terms of Oppenheimer and admiring the team that he surrounded himself with in terms of getting bigger projects done, he took from that. Bob Noyce, again, back to the Intel, and Andy Grove, I think there was some influence there, as well as how he developed out Intel. And then a few other inventors that are on his list of mentors and heroes as well is Akio Morita, and he is the founder of Sony. And the Sony Walkman actually was a lot of the inspiration for the iPod, and the lesson that he learned from Akio was to build something that is very hard to copy. Another inventor here actually is also Alexander Graham Bell. So Steve liked to liken his own introduction of the easy-to-use Macintosh computers to what Alexander Graham Bell had done when he filed patents for the telephones in the 1870s. And he was replacing existing technology with a new way of accomplishing the same task much more easily. And again, back to this reoccurring theme of simplicity, he also looks on Henry Ford and really sought after to create a product as simple as the Model T. And then just to wrap up this section, so again, this is close to 10 people, a lot of different inventors, highly successful founders, and company people here. And the final part of this actually is on the artist front. So again, Steve combines the artistic, creative side with the technology side to create a great outcome for Apple. And so he actually leaned on both Da Vinci as well as Bob Dylan. And what he really admired from them and really gleaned from them as being inspired by their acts is to keep risking failure. And I think that encapsulates a lot of what Steve sought after, and I think really is a void in terms of someone who can push the envelope like that in this day and age in the technology industry, as well as just in general of someone whose voice and presence and his ability to market the products that he developed and really has a lifetime influence on a lot of different lives in this world is something that Steve uniquely as a leader throughout his career was able to do, was really able to inspire, I think, as well, and then able to create products that people simply could not live without. So Steve Jobs of Apple fame really, I think, is a great leader to be studied. Maybe, studied, but not necessarily, I think, replicated, because I think replicating some of the qualities and or some of the styles that he has may not work for someone who has the complete sort of experience or skill set or background and skill set that he would have. So I think with a lot of these kind of leadership observations that we have across these people, and we're able to connect the dots over time as we study, now that we have 2 episodes of kind of comparing and contrasting Senegal with Jobs, you definitely see some contrasting styles there right off the bat in terms of they both had really great results, but they got there in many different ways. Steve really having not like a controversial, I guess, style, but like a different contrasting style with a lot of the qualities and things that made him a person, versus Jim, I think, was very true, authentic, and you could really see the values being played out in his company and had a vision, executed it very well, and that continues to be a playbook that they use today. In Apple's case, there's a lot of great founding principles and philosophy, but, Tim Cook being at the helm right now, it's run in some ways differently, but in some ways, similarly, or trying to embody the same things that Steve had built at Apple, but it is different, and Steve, I think, is one of a kind and is someone continually to be inspired by and learn from. And so that's where we'll leave episode 2, highlighting the brilliance of arguably one of the great executives of our era, Steve Jobs. And so thank you for listening, and we'll be back with episode 3 shortly. Thanks.